Whether you're looking for a Christmas watercolor design for greeting cards to give away this holiday season, or you're simply looking for a fun, holiday-themed watercolor piece to work on to help you continue practicing foundational techniques and developing your water and brush control, this one is for you. In this tutorial, I am taking you through my full painting process in real time for this watercolor gnome piece. We are practicing wet on dry, layering, and we're also bringing in the salting technique to create a beautiful falling snow texture for our background. In the description box right beneath this video, you're going to find a link to a post that I have created over on my Patreon that I have left free and open for everyone to enjoy. If you scroll down to the bottom of that post, you're going to find the downloadables or attachments that I have created to go along with this tutorial. One of those attachments is my outline sketch. If you download that outline sketch, you can transfer it onto your watercolor sheet and get started with the painting process. All right, with all that said, let's jump in. I'm getting started with my color that I'm going to be using for my sky background. And this is a very dark, deep blue color that I am creating. I want the sky to look like the night sky, and I also want to make sure that it's a very dark, deep blue, because since we're going to be using the salting technique, and the salting technique, what it does is it's basically creating little white splotches that at the end I want to make look like snow, right? So for those little white splotches to be more visible, then I need a darker blue background, right? Because the darker the background, the more those white splotches are going to pop out. Whereas if I were creating a lighter background, then that lighter value of the white splotches is not going to contrast as much. So what I did here was I mixed together some Prussian blue plus a tiny bit of Payne's gray. I would recommend playing around with the ratios of your blue and your Payne's gray, or whatever gray or black it is that you're using to deepen and darken it, until you arrive at a deep dark blue that you like. And test out your blue on your scrap piece of watercolor paper before actually using it in your painting. Okay, so after having created that dark, deep, rich blue, it was then time to move on to preparing a couple of different reds for myself. And these are going to be used for the stripes in the hat and also for the little teeny tiny gloves. So the red that I created in that circular well, that is just plain permanent red deep with some water in it. And then to the right of that, on that rectangular well on my color mixing palette, I created a darker version of my red by mixing together some of my permanent red deep plus a little bit of my Payne's gray. After finishing up with that, I removed all of that color from my paintbrush bristles and I went in to create the color that I would be using to paint in the little gnome's nose. So for this, I am simply mixing together some of my permanent red deep plus some of my lemon yellow. And it might look a little bit like a reddish orange right there in my palette, but I'm really going to be using this color in a super, super translucent state. So play around with the ratios of your colors in this color mixture, whatever red and whatever yellow it is you decide to use, and just make sure that you test out this color mixture in a super, super translucent state. You can see me test out this color right here. It's pretty watered down, and indeed it looks like a skin color to me when I use it in this way. Okay, so it's now time to move on to preparing a couple of different greens. So this is my sap green, and I'm going to prepare a little puddle of this plain color with a little bit of water in it. And then to the right of that, you're going to see me develop a darker green, which is going to be sap green plus a little bit of Payne's gray. After this, I'm going to prepare a few different grays for myself because I need gray for the different values that I'm going to be creating throughout the beard, throughout the white stripes and sections in the hat, and also in the snow, and also darker gray for the boots. So that first gray right there in the very bottom well on my color mixing palette is just plain Payne's gray with some water in it. And to the right of that, I am preparing a mixture of Payne's gray plus a little bit of my Prussian blue. So it's the same color mixture that I created in the beginning, but this time it has more Prussian blue in it than before, and it's pretty watered down because that is going to be used for the snow. And I want those values that I developed throughout the snow to be more bluish than grayish. And as I mentioned in the previous tutorial, when we're painting white objects or things like snow, it's very important that we go in with a very pale color, especially initially. So I wanted to make sure to prepare a little bit more of this Prussian blue plus Payne's gray for myself in a slightly more watered down state than the previous mixture that I'm going to be using for the sky. And finally, that one is not really necessary, but I just wanted to create an extra mixture of plain Payne's gray with plenty of water in it, even more than that last plain Payne's gray mixture, so that I could have a second plain Payne's gray mixture in a very watered down state for all of the light gray values that I'm going to be developing in the white sections, like the white stripes and the beard, etc. All right, you guys, so with my color mixtures ready to go, I changed my water because after I prepare my color mixtures, my water is almost always super dirty and super murky, and we're going to be doing pre-wetting in the background. We want to make sure that we're going in with clean water. And it's also important that you have your salt on hand and ready to go because we have to have it right there for us so that we can drop it in immediately after we finish painting the background while that paint is still wet for that beautiful salting texture to happen. All right, so with my color mixtures, my clean container of water, and my salt right beside me ready to go, it was time to get started with doing the pre-wetting using clean water. So I am going to be using my 1-inch flat brush from Royal and Langnickel, and I'm going to be pre-wetting all around the gnome, basically the sky section. I am not going to be pre-wetting the ground, which is going to be the snow. And just like with the first tutorial, I am really taking my time with this pre-wetting process. It's essential that we arrive at a nice even sheen all throughout the background. Before starting to drop in our color, I'm going over everything at least 3 to 4 times, and I'm coming back to areas I've already pre-wetted just to make sure that they are wet enough and that no section of this background starts to dry on me too soon. So I'm continuing to take a little bit of water at a time from my container, bringing it out onto my paper and gliding my paintbrush bristles over my paper gently, many times until I've arrived at a nice even sheen. If you see any puddles anywhere, simply dab your paintbrush bristles on your absorbent towel, go in and use your paintbrush bristles as a little absorbent sponge and go over that area just to remove the excess water. That should help get rid of that puddle. Really take your time with this process. Don't rush it. Make sure that everything is nice and wet. You should be able to allow that water to settle on your paper for at least 15 to 20 seconds before any section of your paper starts to dry on you. And if sections start to dry, it probably means you haven't pre-wetted enough. In just a bit, I'm going to be switching on over to my size 5 round brush to go into the smaller little sections, especially that little shape where that little hat is kind of curving over, that is too small for me to go in with my larger flat brush. You can feel free to switch between your brushes just so that you have a little bit more control when you're pre-wetting those edges of that gnome and also that smaller little shape. Just like with the first piece, this pre-wetting is really going to help us create nice diffused out soft effects, like wet on wet effects. And it's also going to allow us more time to work before our paint starts to dry, which is super, super key. This is why doing pre-wetting is so helpful when we're painting large areas like backgrounds or large washes of paint. That water content that we have laid down on that paper is going to be doing half of that work for us and is going to help us create nice, organic, diffused out effects. And at the same time, we're going to have more working time to develop our color and our values in this large area before our paint starts to dry on us. Okay, so with my paper nice and evenly pre-wetted, and after seeing that I had a nice even sheen all throughout this background area, it was time to start dropping in my dark blue color that I created by mixing together my Prussian blue and my Payne's gray. For this, I switched on over to using my size 6 mop brush, and after having pre-moistened those bristles with clean water, I loaded up those bristles with a good amount of this dark blue color, and as you can see, I am jumping around this entire sky area and dropping in that color in a very irregular and loose way. So what I am aiming for is I want to create unevenness. I don't want a flat blue color all throughout my background. I want to develop a range of translucencies and values when it comes to this blue. And so this is why I am dropping in this color in a very irregular way. I'm even leaving some sections of white paper shining through. And I am really just playing around and dropping in a little bit more color at a time until I arrive at a level of color that I like and an effect that I like. Even though I want some sections to be more translucent and lighter than others, I want to make sure that there is a good amount of this blue on my paper and I have a good amount of color saturation, because if this blue color is super, super light and translucent all throughout, well, remember, number one, watercolor always tends to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet, so that's one thing. But another thing is that when you apply the salt, that texture or that effect is not going to be as visible. So you want a good amount of this blue saturation all throughout, but at the same time, you want somewhat of a variety of values. As you can see, because I took time to do my pre-wetting, my paper is still workable. It's still in a workable state. It's still quite wet. And I can still go ahead and continue depositing more paint if I want to up the saturation of that color here and there. If I hadn't taken the time to do my pre-wetting, certain sections of my paper would already be dry or in a semi-dry, awkward state, at which I should really not be doing much to those areas at all. And so this is why doing that pre-wetting is so helpful. All right, so after I arrived at a look that I liked and a good amount of color saturation in that sky, I switched on over to my size 5 round brush to do some final cleaning up of edges before starting to drop in my salt. After I was happy with how everything was looking, it was time to get started with sprinkling in my salt. The salt that I had in my kitchen kind of had pretty large granules. So what I did in an attempt to break them apart and make them smaller or finer was I just poured a bit of that salt in between a few of my kitchen paper towels, and then I just kind of gently broke them apart with a few different kitchen tools that I had on hand. And I did manage to make them finer, but you can still see how many of these are pretty large and coarse. So it's just important to know that the finer your kitchen salt is that you use, the more little teeny tiny splotches are going to occur, the more texture you're going to end up with. It's important to sprinkle in your salt while that paint is still pretty wet. Otherwise, that texture is not going to happen. And I'm being very generous with the amount of salt that I am sprinkling in. You can see how I have really just dropped in a ton of salt all over that sky background. It totally depends on the amount of texture that you want. If you want more texture like I do, then go ahead and fill up that space with salt. And if you want a smaller amount of texture, then don't sprinkle in as much. Okay, so once that was done, it was time to allow everything to dry completely. And with this one, because we're not using masking fluid, it's totally okay to bring in a hair dryer to speed up the drying process if you want to. I highly, highly recommend to make sure that everything is completely dry before attempting to remove your salt. Because if things are still partially wet, when you try to dust off that salt, you can just smudge your blue, and that's probably not something that you want. So make sure that everything is completely dry, and then you can go ahead and use your hand to dust off that salt. It's hard to remove it all at once, so don't be afraid to leave a bit of salt stuck to the background. It'll fall off eventually. And try to dust it off gently, because you can certainly start exfoliating your skin if you're not careful. And of course, also make sure that your hands are clean and not oily, because if you get hand oils or dirt or anything like that on your watercolor paper, especially the sections that we're going to be painting in next, then those oils, that lotion, that dirt that you get on your paper can affect your paper and can have an impact on how well that color settles and absorbs into it. You can be left with splotches and undesired effects. Okay, so I took time to change my water because it was completely blue at this point. And I also took time to do a little bit of cleanup in my working space because there was salt all over the place. I was pretty happy with the texture I created in the background. You can see how I have a lot of texture all throughout, and that salt really helped me create a very nice kind of illusion of snow falling from the sky. All right, so moving on to the red stripes here. I am going to be using my size 5 round brush. And what you're seeing me do here is I am using my two reds that I created in the beginning of this process. The lighter red, which is just permanent red deep plus water in it, and the darker red, which is permanent red deep plus a little bit of Payne's gray. And essentially what I'm trying to do with these two reds is create a nice variety of values throughout each and every single stripe in this gnome's hat, because I know that it's through the development of different values and translucencies that I'm going to be able to create a sensation of dimension in the gnome's hat if I just use one single color and I use that same color in the same level of translucency or saturation all throughout that stripe. That is going to lead to flatness. And though I'm not going for high levels of realism with this illustration or anything of the sort, I do want to create a nice level of dimension in all of these areas of my piece. And this requires us playing with values and also translucencies of our different colors. And remember, when I say values, really all that means is lights, midtones, and darks. You want to create a variety of values all throughout your painting if you want to make it look believable. And of course, this is also important when we're working specifically with watercolor because it's through this play with the medium's translucency that we're able to create light, glowy looking paintings as opposed. So this is why we set ourselves up for success and create at least a couple of different variations of each color, 2, 3 variations depending on what it is that we're painting, so that we can easily and quickly have exactly the colors that we're going to be requiring to develop dimension in that section of our painting. Okay, so using my size 5 round brush, what I'm going in to do initially is I am creating a light translucent layer of red all throughout that stripe using my lightest red, which is my permanent red deep with just water in it. And if there is any doubt in your mind that maybe this red color mixture is too saturated, I would recommend testing out your red on your scrap piece of watercolor paper before jumping in, just to see that your color is relatively translucent, and if it is not, then just go ahead and add a few more drops into your mixture before using it. I am leaving teeny tiny sections of white paper shining through, which I am embracing as highlights. And these are just little shapes that happen as I am moving my paintbrush around. And then while that initial layer of light translucent red is still wet, I am dropping in a bit of my darker red, the permanent red deep plus a little bit of Payne's gray, here and there where it would make sense that darker values or shadows would be created throughout that stripe, because of course this little gnome's hat is made out of fabric, and fabric bends and folds over itself. And so by deepening and darkening certain sections of shadow where it would make sense, this is going to help add dimension and a level of realism to that little hat. And this really starts since that preliminary outline sketch. So you can probably tell that there is a lot of irregularity and curves going on even with my outline sketch, with my pencil work. And the qualities of this fabric and how it bends and just curves throughout, folds on top of each other, etc., is something that I had in my mind ever since I was creating that preliminary outline sketch. If I just had gone in and had drawn perfect curves from one edge of the hat to the other edge of the hat, or straight lines or anything like that, that would lead to a lot of flatness. And no matter how much of a variety of values that I developed with my color, that would still look pretty unrealistic. So all of this happens ever since creating your preliminary sketches. You already have to give thought to the level of realism that you're trying to create and make sure that the shapes and everything that you lay down since that preliminary sketching process is going to serve as a good foundation for everything else. But anyway, coming back to the painting of the red stripes here. I am continuing to do the exact same thing, getting started with a pretty light translucent version of my first lighter red. And then while that initial red is still wet, I go in and drop in either that same red in a more saturated state or the darker red, which is the one that has the Payne's gray in it. And I'm making sure to drop in my more saturated red or the darker version of my red while that initial layer of red is still wet. I am getting these nice diffused out wet on wet effects in which the darker red merges into the previous lighter red. If you work too slowly and that initial layer of paint starts to dry on you, then you're going to be left with sharp defined edges around the red shapes that you paint in. So you do have to work relatively quickly if you want that sort of merging to happen. And this is why it's so important to have enough of your different color mixtures ready for you, and also to know exactly what colors you have to reach out for to create more of whatever color mixtures it is that you need for that point in time during the painting process. This is why it's important to plan out the colors that you're going to be using for the different areas of your painting and for the different values that you're going to be requiring before getting started with your painting process. All right, so I finished up with painting the red stripes. I removed all of that red from my paintbrush bristles. I'm going to continue using my size 5 round brush, by the way, but feel free to use a smaller brush if you feel more comfortable with a smaller brush, because we're going to be painting in the little gnome's nose, and it's a very small shape there. So we created that color mixture for the nose by combining the red with yellow. So the two colors that I personally use for this were the permanent red deep plus my lemon yellow. And you can see how it looks pretty orange in that middle round well in my color mixing palette, but I made sure to use this color in a very, very highly translucent state. And I even tested it out right there on my scrap piece of watercolor paper, which you can see to my left, to ensure that it looks like a relatively believable skin tone before jumping in and using that color in my piece. Same as with the previous sections that I was painting in the red stripes, I went in initially with this color in a super, super watered down state to create that initial light layer of color, making sure to leave a little section of highlight in which that paper was shining through completely unpainted. And then I went ahead and dropped in a little bit more of this color in a slightly more saturated state in that edge right below the hat, where it would make sense that that hat would be creating a little bit of a shadow on the nose. Essentially, I was aiming for at least 3 different values in that little nose. So I have the very bright highlight, I have that light translucent skin color, and then I have that third next darker skin color in little sections that I want to darken even more. And it's very important that because that shape is super small, that you go in with only a small amount of paint and water in your bristles, because if you go in with a ton of paint and water, that color is going to start expanding into that entire nose shape, and you're going to be left with flatness. After finishing up with painting that nose, I removed all of that color from my paintbrush bristles and I switched on over to working on the little gnome's green suit. I'm still using my size 5 round brush for this, and the technique is exactly the same as I've been using so far for the red stripes and for the nose. So we created 2 different greens for ourselves. I have my plain sap green with water in it, and also my sap green plus a little bit of the Payne's gray. So I'm going right in and painting on dry paper using my size 5 round brush, and I'm going in initially with my lighter green in a pretty translucent state. I also took time to test out that lightest green to make sure that I wasn't going in super saturated even with this lighter green. You can see how I tested out that green on my scrap piece of watercolor paper before going in, because I want to make sure that that initial layer is pretty light and translucent, so that I have something to build on, to build those darker midtones and darkest darks on and be able to create a little bit more dimension. And with that initial layer of light translucent green still wet, I then dropped in more of my sap green in a slightly more saturated state in sections within that larger shape that I wanted to deepen and darken. So I really just brought in what I know to be true about how light works and how certain masses of volume, so the head of this gnome, his beard, this little sign is holding up, and just the overall structure of the little body, how everything works. And I just started depositing the darker midtones, the darker greens in sections where it would make sense that darker values or shadows would be present. And because we're working on paper that is dry, it's important to move relatively quickly, especially when you're laying down that first lightest layer of paint. Because the moment you start placing paint on paper, it starts getting absorbed and it starts drying. That paper starts soaking it up immediately. And so you have to move relatively quickly. If you're going to load up your paintbrush with more paint, go ahead and pick up exactly where you left off along the last edge of the last shape that you painted in, and continue filling in that area. Because if not, you're going to be left with hard defined edges around all of your shapes, and that can probably lead to a texture that you don't want. But even after you've laid down that initial layer of green, it's still important to work relatively quickly before that paint starts to dry on you, especially if you want those soft gradients to happen between your lighter greens and your darker greens. It's a wet on wet effect that is occurring, and you have to make sure that you're depositing that next color on paint that is still wet. Okay, so hopefully along the way, you're noticing how much I am supporting myself with my absorbent towel that I have right there on my left, with my scrap piece of watercolor paper that I am constantly using to test out colors and transparencies, and how I am going in many times to do some lifting of that excess color and excess water that I've accidentally laid down on my paper to make sure that no section in my painting is too flat. Remember that you have all of these tools whenever you go in with way too much paint, too saturated a color, you've accidentally gone in with way too much water. Support yourself with your absorbent towel, with the clean and only slightly damp bristles of your paintbrush. Use those paintbrush bristles as a little absorbent sponge and go in and do some lifting. No problem at all. Okay, so once I was done with that green suit, it was time to start painting in the snow on the ground. And what I am doing here is I switched on over to my 1-inch flat brush once again, and I did some pre-wetting using water. I pre-wetted the entire bottom section of my piece, including the little gnome's boots. And then with that bottom section evenly pre-wetted and glistening with that water, I switched on over to my size 6 mop brush, and I loaded it up with a bit of this Prussian blue plus Payne's gray color mixture that I had prepared for myself on my color mixing palette, which is very watered down. It's super important that when you're painting snow or anything white for that matter, that you go in with a very pale translucent color. And then if you want to deepen and darken certain sections, you can go in and drop a little bit more color at a time. But you want to use your colors in a pretty translucent state, especially initially. And you also want to make sure that you leave plenty of that white paper shining through if you want the snow to look white, or any white object or animal that you are painting. So I dropped in a little bit of that Prussian blue plus Payne's gray color mixture, heavier on the Prussian blue, and then I dropped in some of my Payne's gray. And I also took that Payne's gray from the mixture that I had prepared for myself on that color mixing palette, which was pretty translucent, pretty watered down. And I placed that Payne's gray especially right below the gnome's feet, where I wanted to create a little bit of an illusion of cast shadow. Okay, so after that snow section had been painted in, it was time to allow that to dry completely, and it was time to start developing the gray values in the little gnome's beard and also in the white stripes in the hat. So I switched on back to using my size 5 round brush, and I am once again taking that same pure Payne's gray with water in it. And you can see how I'm taking that gray from the last color mixture that I was using for the snow. That Payne's gray that has a lot of water in it, that is very watered down, very translucent. And I am still helping myself with my scrap piece of watercolor paper to test out this gray before jumping in. And this is especially important because, as opposed to what we were just doing with the snow, we're going in on dry paper. We're not doing any pre-wetting. And what's important to remember is that when you haven't gone in and prepared that paper with a layer of water, that color is going to look darker than how it would look if you were going to place that same exact color mixture on paper that has been pre-wetted, because there is no water content that is going to receive that paint and make it expand out. When you paint a shape on dry paper, it's going to start soaking up into that paper immediately, and it's not going to expand out into any wetness, which would inherently make it look lighter. It's going to stay constricted and limited to that shape, which is going to make it look darker than if you painted on pre-wetted paper. And because of this, and because of the fact that all these areas that we're painting in are supposed to be white elements, white hair, white fabric, etc. and so forth, it is very, very important that you go in with pale translucent color and add in just a little bit of color at a time and start adding those darker gray values gradually, really only in the spaces that you want to darken further. So as you can see, I added a little bit of a shadow effect with my gray right underneath that hat, in that bottom edge of that hat, where it would make sense that the hat would be creating a cast shadow on the gnome's head or face. And then for the hair texture or hair area in the beard, I used quite different brush strokes from the brush strokes that I am using to develop those light gray values in the fabric in the hat. When I started developing those light gray values in the beard, I started using downwards kind of curved strokes, paying attention to the shapes and the lines that I had created for myself in that preliminary outline sketch, and trying my best to create tapered lines going down to help me describe that hair texture. And then in the fabric in the hat, I really went in, I did even some dry brushing in which I was taking just a small amount of paint and dragging my paintbrush, even the belly of the paintbrush, in a more sideways motion to create a little bit of a dry brushing effect, and just added in those light gray values in a very irregular way. Once again, paying attention to where I wanted to make that fabric look like it was kind of dipping or denting down, right? Paying attention to the curves that I had already started creating in that hat with my preliminary pencil sketch and also with my red stripes. Really, less is more when creating these light gray values. You can see how I was very minimal with these light grays that I created both in the beard and throughout the hat. And if you want to go in and soften any edges, you can go ahead and remove the color from your paintbrush bristles and go in with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush and run those bristles over the edges of your shapes to soften the edges. Then it was time to allow those lighter grays to dry completely, and while I did that, I went ahead and quickly painted in the little gnome's gloves. And for that, I just used my darker red because those shapes are so small. After painting in the red gloves, it was time to do a tiny bit more detailing work in the beard. I'm going to be developing a little bit more of that hair texture using just the tip of my paintbrush in downwards flicking motions. And I'm also going to be pushing darker gray areas just a little bit more now that those initial grays have dried completely. Watercolor is always going to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet, so it's always worth coming back to notice if you have to push darker areas just a little bit more to add the depth and dimension that you're looking for. Okay, so we are officially in the very last leg of this painting process. I'm gonna go ahead and get started with painting in the boots. By the way, this entire bottom section of my painting is completely dry, and I would recommend you making sure that all of this snow section in the lower section of your painting is completely dry before attempting to paint in the boots. Otherwise, the shapes that you start painting in are going to bleed out into that wetness, and that is something that I personally don't want for the boots. You can see how even throughout the boots, I made sure to go in with my gray, which is just the Payne's gray with some water in it, in a pretty translucent state, and I want to develop somewhat of a variety of values even throughout the boots. So this is why I made sure to go in initially with this gray in a pretty translucent state. I'm still using my size 5 round brush, by the way, and later on I'm going to come back and do a little bit more work after this initial layer has dried. Even in the boots, I am leaving little teeny tiny sections of highlights that are naturally happening as I am moving my paintbrush around. If I create very large highlights, sometimes I do paint over them, but some of these I just embrace as highlights, and you can see how that previous lighter layer that I created when I was painting in the snow is just left shining through, completely unpainted. And I am trying to move along quickly because I'm painting these shapes on dry paper. Okay, so it was time to allow that initial layer of gray in the boots to dry before doing a little bit more work in there. In the meantime, I am going to be working on my pen and ink work that I'm going to be doing for the little Merry Christmas sign. So what I am using today is one of my pigment liners from Stadler, and what I decided to go with for this one is a 0.3 tip size. And all I am doing here is I had previously written down these two words in the sign using my pencil. Whenever it is that I'm going to be adding in handwritten lettering, because I am not a calligrapher and I haven't studied calligraphy, I do help myself with adding in those words that I'm going to be inking using pencil first. So I trace over my pencil work, or at least use those letters that I've created myself first with pencil as a guide to make sure that my words are going to be centered and that they will fit within the space that I need them to fit in. The letter design that I decide to go for with this one is simple. I just did those initial basic letters. And then all I am doing here is I am thickening certain sections of those letters. And all I am doing is going over those lines with my pen very carefully just to make certain sections of those letters look a little bit thicker than others. You can certainly feel free to change the words entirely if you want to add in Merry Xmas instead of Christmas, or anything that you'd like, or change the letter design or the type of lettering that you're using into a script or something like that. Totally feel free to do it. But whatever you decide to do, I would recommend you add it in with pencil first before jumping in and doing the pen and ink work, because pen and ink is permanent and there is no taking back that black ink after you have placed it on paper. Okay, so I'm just finishing up with the letters here, and I'm trying to keep it consistent in terms of what side of that letter I am thickening or darkening or making heavier, and trying to keep that consistent throughout all of my letters. I wanted to keep my lettering relatively simple for this because I don't want these words to take away from my little gnome. I want the viewer's attention to go to the little gnome first and then to the handwritten message. Okay, so after finishing with my pen and ink work, it was time to finish with adding in the cast shadow under the gnome's boots, and also to add darker value areas in the boots themselves. So all of this I'm going to be doing with my Payne's Gray. I am going to be using my size 5 round brush for this, and I'm going to go right in to paint these shapes on dry paper. So for these areas, we already have what could be considered gray midtones already developed, both on the ground and also in the boots. So I can allow myself to go in with this Payne's Gray in a bit of a slightly more saturated state, but I'm still not going in super thick or anything like that. I'm still bringing in that idea of working gradually towards darker values. So the first thing that you saw me do with this Payne's Gray was I added in that darker section of occlusion shadow inside of the larger cast shadow area that I had already developed in the snow section on the bottom left of this gnome, where this gnome's body is impeding that light from the sky from hitting that ground underneath him. After painting in that section of occlusion shadow, I started developing darker value shapes throughout the boots. So this entire gnome was drawn from imagination, but again, just like with everything else, I am bringing in what I know to be true about boots and shoes and their overall structure, and where it would make sense for me to push darker value areas, and that's where I am painting in and carving out those darker shapes. Now, because I am painting them in on dry paper, I am left with hard to find edges around the shapes that I am painting in. So if at any point in time you want to go in and soften the edges of your shapes, you can certainly remove the color from your paintbrush bristles and go back in with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush and soften those edges. Make sure that you see these dark gray shapes that you're pushing more as abstract, irregular shapes, and stay away from the look of big, heavy shapes and also outlines, because that leads to a flatter look. As you can see, I am leaving plenty of those lighter, more translucent grays shining through because I'm only darkening and deepening dark value sections. Okay, so after finishing up with the boots and the occlusion shadow section, I went ahead and erased my pencil that was visible through my pen and ink work that I just did before. It's important that if you do anything with pen and ink that you allow that ink to dry completely before attempting to erase anything. So that's why I had jumped on over to working on the boots before I erased that pencil work that was still showing. And finally, I went in to just define some little edges here and there and deepen and darken some little teeny tiny sections throughout the piece. And for that, I really just used the same color that I was using underneath, only this time it was slightly more saturated. And less is really more for that final part of the process in which you're going in and just darkening certain sections and maybe defining certain edges of certain shapes here and there. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.